We will start. Hello, everyone. I'm Rola Kilajian. I am the Communications Officer at the Arab Council for the Social Sciences. Thank you for joining our webinar today, Critical Theory Encounters Palestine. This is our third webinar in our Thinking Critically with Palestine series. This event has been co-organized with the American University of Beirut as part of Palestine Week. The language of this session is going to be English, but translation to Arabic is available for those registered over Zoom. We welcome your questions. Please send them either through Zoom, the chat over Zoom, the Q&A, or as a comment to our Facebook page. We will try to answer as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar. I will hand over now to Dr. Satani Shami, Director General of the Arab Council for the Social Sciences, who will be followed by Dr. Rima Majed, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the AUB, and an ACSS Board of Trustees member. Dr. Rima will be moderating this webinar. Satani?
Thank you, Rula, and welcome everyone to our third webinar in our Palestine series. This series was developed in close consultation with the ACSS Board of Trustees, and over several weeks of discussion, the series took shape and the speakers were invited. I would like to thank the Board of Trustees for their hard work on this series and this important series. In addition, each webinar is moderated and chaired by a member of the board, and so I thank Dr. Rima Majed for taking on this role in this particular webinar. We're also very pleased, as Rula mentioned, that this webinar is jointly organized with the American University of Beirut, our partner and neighbor here in Beirut, within their Palestine Week series of activities. The first two webinars in our series were held in Arabic. The first one was entitled The Resonance of Palestine in Arab Contexts, and the second one was on Imagining Decolonial Futures Through Palestine. In this webinar, we are holding the session in English, as was mentioned, although we have simultaneous translation. By switching languages, we do hope to reach out to somewhat different audiences, although we do know that we have a solid core of participants who follow our activities online, and we welcome them to this webinar. In all these webinars, we are, of course, centrally concerned with the present-day ravaging and erasure of Palestine. But also we would like to look at how what is happening today reopens the past and histories of Palestine and the region in new ways, in addition to pointing the way to multiple possible futures. In these webinars, however, Palestine is not only a geopolitical space of struggle, aggression, and hegemony, although this in itself would take up many hours of discussion and thought. Palestine is also an example, a paradigm, a litmus test, a challenge to think with and to think through. In this series, we think together with Palestine, in solidarity with Palestine, but are also cognizant of the lessons it embodies for other places and other times. We hope that in this webinar and in the series, we lay the groundwork for intellectual agendas with real-world implications, and we also hope to thicken and expand the network of concerned social scientists and humanists who struggle for justice and peace through their work. So once again, thank you to all those who helped organize this webinar. Thanks to our speakers and moderator today. Thank you to the translators, and many thanks to the listeners and participants. I hand over to Dr. Rima Majed now.
Thank you so much, Rola and Satani, and thank you everyone for being here. And as much as I'm really thrilled to be in the presence of great thinkers and to be having this very important discussion, I must say that I'm also utterly disgusted that we're having this discussion while the genocide is still ongoing. When we started thinking about the series last year, actually, a few weeks after the genocide had started, we were wishfully thinking that by the time the series materializes, the war would be over, the genocide would be over. Unfortunately, this is not the case. This particular webinar, Critical Theory Encounters Palestine, And if I am to continue the title, I would say critical theory encounters Palestine, stutters, fails, and fails again, is really aimed at thinking about the silences and amongst critical theorists and critical theory more broadly around Palestine, the difficulties today of pushing this boundary within a space that many of us have thought for many decades as a space where these discussions should be easier than other spaces. I mean, the utter shock of many of us at the failures with many theorists at the beginning, but also as this genocide unfolds, in making coherent arguments based on this tradition of critical theory regarding Palestine. Today, we have two very distinguished scholars who have a long experience in thinking around Palestine and in a critical way. We will start with Professor Nadia El-Haj, who is an Anne Whitney Olin professor in the Department of Anthropology at Barnard College and Columbia University. She also serves as vice president and vice chair of board at the Institute for Palestine Study in Washington, D.C. Professor El-Haj is the recipient of numerous awards. Among other publications, she's the author of Facts on the Ground, Archaeological Practice and Territorial Self-Fashioning in Israeli Society, which won the Albert Hourani Annual Book Award from the Middle East Studies Association 2002. She's also the author of the genealogical science, the search for Jewish origins, and the politics of epistemology. And finally, she's also the author of Combat Trauma, Imaginaries of War and Citizenship in Post-9/11 America. Our second speaker is Professor Zahi Zalloua, who's the Cushing Eells Professor of Philosophy and Literature at Whitman College in the United States. He's also the author of numerous books. The one is forthcoming with Ilan Kapoor of Universal Politics, and no, one is he's the co-author with Ilan Kapoor of Universal Politics, and the author of The Politics of Direct Race, Reason, and Resentment, and this is the forthcoming one. Professor Zalloua is also the author of Solidarity and the Palestinian Cause, Indigeneity, Blackness, and the Promise of Universality. He's the author of Being Post-Human, Ontologies of the Future, and the author of Zizek on Race, Towards an Anti-Racist Future, amongst many other publications of Professor Zalloua. So I'm really very thrilled to be in the presence of both Professor El-Haj and Zalloua. The floor is now yours, Professor El-Haj. Each one will present for around 20 minutes, and then we will open the floor up for a discussion with the audience.
Thank you, Rima, for that introduction, and to Satane and everyone else here for inviting me. Zahi and I are experiencing this slaughter from a very different context, politically and morally. And at times one feels like one is living, I don't know, I feel like it's schizophrenic, as in I know what's real, but the world around me is telling me I'm crazy. So this paper is very much trying to think about the war on Gaza from the context of the US and the West. So here we go. Over the past 4 months, those of us in the US and Europe have spent a lot of time arguing about the meaning of particular words. A lot of ink has been spilt condemning allegedly anti-Semitic speech. From the river to the sea, intifada. What do those words really mean? What motivates those words chanted at peaceful rallies around the US and the world? Is anti-Zionist speech inherently anti-Semitic? Is anti-Zionist speech evidence of the rampant spread of anti-Semitism on university campuses? How does it make Jewish students feel? Many, many other words have been spoken since October 7th, of course, words whose meanings and intentions are manifest, there for all to hear, if only they chose to listen. There is no need to dig beneath words and phrases to discover what they really mean, what they intend. Quote, they are human animals and will be treated as such, Yoav Gallant, Israel's Ministry of Defense, declared a few days after October 7th. Food, fuel, water, and electricity will be cut off, he stated. And so it is. A few days later, Daniel Hagari, an IDF spokesperson, described war still at its beginning, quote, the emphasis is on damage, not accuracy. And so it has been. Israel's president, Isaac Herzog, said, the entire nation of Gaza is responsible for the attacks. It is not true, this rhetoric about civilians not being aware, not involved, quote, and sparing no one, indeed, is their strategy. And just a few weeks ago, humanizing Herzog's words, one wonders, is that what he thought he was doing? A former head of a division of the captive and missing of the Mossad told an Israeli news anchor, there are no innocent civilians in Gaza over the age of 4, but those under the age of 4 should get humanitarian aid. Such words are not exceptional. This is everyday speech among Israelis. These are words spoken by politicians, military leaders, and journalists from across the political spectrum. These are words spoken by soldiers who perform destruction in Gaza and gleefully do it before their camera phones. These are the kinds of words on bumper stickers. One I saw recently said, finish them in English. And then Israel, the people of Israel lives in Hebrew. And on banners unfurled over bridges in Tel Aviv. One said, if one person survives, we will not have won, unquote. The very same politicians, journalists, pundits, students, and university presidents and trustees, among others in the US and elsewhere, who insist on decrying pro-Palestinian speech in the name of what it really means, don't seem to be bothered by these other words. They also don't take the speakers at their word, but this time in order to exonerate them rather than to condemn them. They couldn't possibly mean what they say. Let me give but one in an endless series of examples. In response to the first bombing of the Jabalia refugee camp on October 31st, 2023, recall the Israeli military dropped a 2,000-pound bomb on one of the most densely populated places on earth. Jonathan Kirby, the White House spokesperson on national security, stated, quote, we're not going to react to every attack, but we certainly know that civilians have been hurt. Civilians have been killed to the tune of many thousands. We're continuing to stay in touch with our Israeli counterparts about the need to continue to minimize civilian casualties as much as possible. But then he said, and I quote again, the killing of civilians is not a war aim of Israel, unquote. But what if it is? Isn't that precisely what the Israeli political and military leadership, let alone its many news anchors and op-ed writers and many an ordinary soldier and citizen has been saying all along? South Africa's case charging Israel with genocide before the International Court of Justice took them at their word. Israel, they charge, quote, has failed to curb incitement to genocide by its own officials in violation of the convention, unquote. And as evidence since the war on Gaza began in October, such incitements are not just words. Intention has been made ever more manifest in what the Israeli military has done and continues to do. In its filing, South Africa refers to the killing of Palestinians in large numbers, especially children, the destruction of their homes. South Africa's case cited the expulsion and displacement of the vast majority of Palestinians from their homes in Gaza, the blockade on food, water, and medical assistance to the Strip, the imposition of measures preventing Palestinian births by destroying essential health services crucial for the survival of pregnant women and babies, among other things. These military tactics are acts of genocide, the lawyers argued before the court. In short, quote, by killing Palestinians in Gaza, causing them serious mental and bodily harm, and by creating conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction, Israel is committing genocide. In response, over 200 members of the US Congress wrote a joint letter to the American Secretary of State, quote, South Africa has filed a grossly unfounded case against Israel at the International Court, accusing Israel of genocide and asking the court to order Israel to immediately halt its military efforts in Gaza. They continued, We write to you to express our disgust, note the word, at this filing, which perpetrates false and dangerous accusations against the Jewish state, note not Israel. They continued, quote, the accusation was particularly cynical given the term genocide was coined following the murder of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, unquote. For its part, Germany declared that it, quote, decisively and expressly rejects the accusation of genocide brought against Israel. It has no basis in fact. In view of this is still a quote, of Germany's history and crime against humanity of the Shoah, the Holocaust, the federal government sees itself as particularly committed to the Convention Against Genocide. We firmly oppose its political instrumentalization, unquote. Apparently, having perpetrated a horrific genocide gives one moral standing to adjudicate subsequent ones. Israel, of course, rejected South Africa's charge, telling the court that it is, quote, outrageous to liken the Jewish state's military response to Hamas attacks launched from Gaza to Nazi Germany's systematic extermination of 6 million Jews during the Holocaust, unquote. And then framing the South African case squarely within the history of Christian anti-Semitism, it accused South Africa of blood libel. No doubt there's a lot of public posturing going on here, and certainly among Israel's Euro-American allies facing a lot of opposition on their own streets. But I want to take the discourse seriously. I want to draw attention to the terms in and through which the charge is being denied. It is outrageous, it is disgusting. Denials refer repeatedly to the Jewish state, not the Israeli state, to the Shoah, to the idea of accusing the Jewish state of genocide, when the very genocide convention was drawn up in response to the final solution, is almost more than can be borne. The very terms of rejection and denial speak the grammar of a post-Second World War Euro-American order of ethics and politics within the question of Palestine has always already been ensnared. And that ethical order makes the claim of Israeli genocide not just wrong or debatable, but obscene and impossible, certainly for the powers that be. Theories of genocide abide from Hannah Arendt to, far more recently, the French psychiatrist and anthropologist Richard Whitman, to name but two. How does it become possible to wipe out another people or race? Who is the génocidaire? What is his psychological makeup? Is that even the most important question to ask? As is well known, genocide involves the dehumanization of the victim, but it also requires the perpetrator to routinize killing, for it to be normalized. But I want to think about the problem of the perpetrator from a different angle here, and the political and ethical blockages it's creating in the West. The figure of the Jewish soldier and the Jewish state as an impossible génocidaire. In Silencing the Past, the late anthropologist Michel Wolf-Foucault wrote, quote, when reality does not coincide with deeply held beliefs, human beings devise formulas to repress the unthinkable and bring it back within the realm of acceptable discourse, unquote. While this may sound like a self-conscious strategy, Foucault's discussion of the Haitian Revolution reveals his claim to be much deeper. The revolution, he writes, was unthinkable. There were a series of events, enslaved persons running away, killing their masters, burning plantations, but such acts could not add up to a revolution, certainly not from the French and settler point of view. Enslaved Africans were incapable of envisioning freedom within the racial order, a conviction based, of course, not on empirical evidence, but rooted in, and I quote, an ontology, an implicit organization of the world and its inhabitants. In short, revolution's an act of politics. It is a distinctly human capacity. Enslaved persons were not humans, ergo, they were not capable of revolutionary action. And as such, he writes, the Haitian Revolution was an impossible history, even as it unfolded before their very eyes. Is the war in Gaza an impossible genocide from the perspective of the West? That Israel is even potentially carrying out a genocide is haunted by a parallel impossibility. How can the Jewish state commit genocide, a crime against humanity for which the Jewish people is the divining, the victim in the West? Is such a claim an ontological possibility, given the foundational role that the Holocaust plays, not just in the Geneva Convention, but more importantly, in the moral, political, and social imaginaries on which the post-Second World War international order was built. What would such a recognition do to a Euro-American sensibility regarding its own post-war moral foundations and its role in global politics and policing, both during and following the Cold War? An edited volume with a decidedly political project, The Holocaust and the Nakba, that's the title of the book, set out to forge a discursive space within which these two seemingly incompatible events could be thought together. Most broadly, it's a collection of essays that asks us to rethink the history of Israel and Palestine by taking seriously the Holocaust and the Nakba as foundational paths that cannot be severed one from the other. The volume speaks of political urgency. As the co-editors argue, the future of Palestine and Israel partly depends on how we grapple with its narrativized past, the Nakba and the Holocaust, that is. In their introductory chapter, Bashir and Amos Goldberg sketched the contours of the overarching project in the following words, quote, both the Holocaust and the Nakba as dominant narratives, national narratives, serve to bolster exclusive identities within the two groups. For the most part, each group sees its own catastrophe as a unique event and seeks to devalue or even deny the catastrophe of the other, unquote. They go on to say that these two narratives are largely contradictory, perhaps hostile to one another, and certainly competing, unquote. And yet, they insist they must be made to speak to one another. But as I wrote in response to that project, what if they cannot be made to speak to one another, not in any way that allows for any form of commensuration? They cannot be compared because they do not appear on the same ethical stage. There is a foundational asymmetry here. The Nakba is the foundational tragedy for Palestinians, for Palestinian nationalism, as the book itself makes clear. The Holocaust, on the other hand, is a foundational narrative, the moral and political foundation that is a central hegemonic narrative of the entire West. And I'm quoting from the book. One, in short, is a tragedy for a particular people. The other, a lesson for humanity. That Holocaust imaginary did not simply emerge once and for all out of the Second World War, the ratifying of the Geneva Convention in 1949 notwithstanding. The Holocaust, not just as a singular event, but as an incomparable and foundational one, developed over the next few decades, with the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961 a key turning point. As Hannah Arendt made clear, the trial was less about the man himself, who was guilty prima facie, than it was a history lesson for an Israeli and a global audience, read Western audience. The Nazi genocide and all its specific horrors were recounted on the witness stand. The genocide was framed as yet one more iteration in a long history of the persecution of the Jewish people since time immemorial, albeit its most gruesome instantiation. What's more, as Annette Viviorka has written, the figure of the survivor as witness to these horrors, was also born on that judicial stage. In that courtroom, witness after witness told stories of what they had endured and survived, most of which had nothing to do with the question of Eichmann's juridical guilt. This was a history lesson, told not through the cold medium of history, as Viviorka writes, but via an appeal to emotion. And the trial marked the advent of the witness as a social, rather, figure that exceeds its juridical role. By the trial's end, the survivor had acquired a social identity at the heart of which stood, quote, a new function to be the bearer of history. Testimony would be a way of repairing the irreparable. And the witness emerges over time as, quote, an apostle and a prophet, bearing insights into evil and the depths to which humanity can sink that no one else could even fathom. Even though by the final decades of the 20th century, this witness as apostle was incorporated other categories of survivors, most notably survivors of rape and incest, although, as I write in my recent book, also of the American soldier as perpetrator in the post-9/11 wars. Nevertheless, it has never escaped the shadow of the Holocaust, or to borrow Adi Ophir's words, he's a philosopher, the, quote, sanctification of Auschwitz. An Israeli philosopher, Ophir, describes his project in his book, The Order of Evils, as an effort to, quote, think the moral matter and interpret moral categories, such as loss, suffering, and indifference, from within the limiting conditions of the Israeli context and to escape and exit them. I quote, These limitations are first and foremost relevant to the meaning of the Holocaust in Israeli culture, and I would add the West, and the status of Auschwitz as a synonym of absolute radical evil, a criterion for every possible evil and an exemplary model for every future evil, unquote. This halo or sanctification that is Auschwitz, to borrow Ophir's frame, haunts any attempt in the Euro-American world to consider whether or not Israel's war on Gaza, whether or not in its war on Gaza, the Jewish state is committing genocide. Recall the very terms and names of the pushback. The charge is disgusting. It's outrageous. It's not just wrong or implausible or factually incorrect. The Shoah, the killing of 6 million Jews, the Jewish state, those are the very words and reference that are repeatedly mentioned, that apparently must be mentioned and are constitutive of the outrage. And to go back to something, Rima, you said in the beginning, which is the failure of critical theorists, even if the sort of outrage and horror at this charge tends to be in a much more Zionist, hegemonic common sense, there are a lot of critical theorists who are not comfortable with the charge. They wouldn't go as far as to call it disgusting, but it's kind of like, well, it's not really. Why are we using the term, right? These are the speech acts of an impossible genocide. This is the ground that makes it impossible to hear the word genocide, or for that matter, even mass slaughter and wanton destruction in speech acts that are decidedly unambiguous. Benjamin Netanyahu, quote, "You must remember what Amalek has done to you," says our Holy Bible. I continue now, the biblical quote. Quote, "Now go and smite Amalek and utterly destroy all they have and spare them not. Slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass," unquote. There's been a popular song that's been made out of this in the last few months in Israel. In a recent interview with the New York Times, it was on a video, a young, blonde, charming Israeli woman, a settler, answers the interviewer's question and says, "Yes, I guess I'm a little bit fascist. It's the only way." She giggles, flips her hair back as she says these words, seemingly unoffensive. What do we make of her laughter? Is it her sense that being a Jewish fascist is an oxymoron? Is it that she knows she will never be held to account? She, after all, can't really be a fascist, a génocidaire. What about all the soldiers who gleefully filming and celebrating mass destruction, the destruction of a mosque, the blowing up of entire neighborhoods so that no one will be able to return, or the bumper sticker I mentioned earlier, "Finish them. The Israeli people lives." We know that the very possibility of genocide and the carnage of war more generally, take the post 9/11 American wars or the American war in Vietnam, requires dehumanizing the enemy. Palestinians are animals and we will treat them as such, to go back to Yoav Gallant's words. But the problem here may well exceed the ontology of the Palestinian as victim. What if there's a second ontology operating, one equally and perhaps even more deeply entrenched, that is, that the Jew and the Jewish state cannot possibly be génocidaire? If we are to be able to have this conversation, it is essential to clear a space, to return once more to Adi Ophir's frame, within which we can discuss the current catastrophe outside of the sanctification condensed in the name Auschwitz, and outside the ethical frame within which its survivors and their descendants cannot possibly be carrying out a genocide. Only by clearing that space might we be able to confront an evil that is far more urgent than is the evil of Auschwitz, not because it is necessarily worse, but as Ophir writes about evil in general or in the contemporary moment, because it is, quote, "being produced now in conditions that can still be amended and a future evil that could still be prevented." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadia. We'll turn now to Zahi.
Thank you very much, Nadia, for this wonderful talk. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this important discussion. So what does it mean for critical theory to encounter Palestine? For me, it means at least three things. One, Palestine compels critical theory or philosophy. I will use them interchangeably, to reckon with history. 2, Palestine calls for a questioning of the ways the West delineates who matters and who doesn't. 3, Palestine induces a crisis in disavowal, a disruption in the status quo. Now I'll elaborate briefly on these 3 separate but related points. 1, reckoning with history. In reckoning with history, philosophy or critical theory can take its cue from the anti-colonial left. In stark contrast to mainstream Western media's coverage of the Gaza war, where Israel's right to self-defense is constantly affirmed without a real consideration of Israel's status as an occupier, let alone a settler state. An anti-colonial leftist orientation points in a different direction. It prompts us to historicize the situation, to seek to understand the circumstances surrounding the deadly assault of October 7th. To see Hamas's attack as unprovoked is to adopt what Eve Tuck described as a dishonest framing. Such a narcissistic framing of the situation, Palestinian violence provokes Israeli self-defense, has rendered invisible the Palestinian cause and concealed the settler native antagonism. It adopts, quote, a reckless indifference to history, to use a language of the open letter philosophy for Palestine. This framing adopts a reckless indifference to the historical and ongoing colonial condition and couches it as an expression of moral rectitude. Aggravating further this failure is the West's condemnation of all forms of armed struggle on the Palestinian side. Even when Palestinians are returning fire, they're seen as always already guilty, as somehow predisposed to terrorize. To be clear, for Israel and the West, the problem is not how Palestinians resist, but that they resist. Any resistance to their subjugation, to their erasure, marks Palestinians as anti-Semitic and unnecessarily violent. Palestinian actions are not really meant to be understood. They are never understood as responses to the occupation. Indeed, it is much easier to condemn Hamas's being, the very existence of its fighter, than to understand its rage and violence and the conditions that produced it. Let us not forget, Hamas did not materialize out of thin air. There is a context that helps to explain, not justify, its emergence. So it is a gross distortion of reality to say that Hamas is the reason for the ongoing Zionist occupation. Reproaching Hamas over its human rights violation while justifying Israel's destruction of the Gaza Strip as if the Israeli military had no other choices is wrong and irresponsible. The Palestinian desire for dignity and freedom will not be extinguished by the defeat of Hamas. Hamas and its theocratic vision may well be an obstacle for a just peace, but we should not forget that this political movement is the symptom, not the cause of the occupation. Or to paraphrase Ta-Nehisi Coates, Hamas is the child of the occupation, not the father. You can try to bomb Palestinians into submission. You can get rid of Hamas, but unless you reckon with the occupation, with Israel's settled colonial regime, the unbearable situation of subjugation will continue to generate new symptoms, new figures of resistance struggling for liberation. With the full backing of Western leaders and a submissive media outlet, in the US in particular, Israel exercises its colonial privileges, healing its narcissistic wound by pounding Gaza into a wasteland. The state's right to self-defense transmutes into the right to subjugate, the right to persecute, the right to occupy, the right to ethnically cleanse, or simply the right to all of Palestine. Western heads of state seem to admire the masculine sovereignty that Israel displays, its capacity to exceptionalize itself and impose its will on the colonized in plain sight. By expressing solidarity with Israel and supporting its military decisions, Western powers are in part reiterating their superiority and authority, trying to fend off any cause for a reckoning with their own colonial past and its aftermath. Bifo Berardi rightly grasped the racist perversity of Western reasons embodied mainly by Germans, but also in other Europeans. They, quote, will protect Israel no matter what, because they are no longer the enemy of our superior race, but part of it. Therefore, they have been granted the privilege that we already have, the privilege of the colonizers, of the exploiters, of the exterminators, end quote. It is still the privilege of the West to label who matters and who doesn't, to label who is human and who is a human animal. As Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, cruelly put it, and Nadia made that point several times already. In this ruthless occupation and genocidal onslaught on Gaza, Israel stands as a reminder and a remainder of colonial viciousness. 2, the politics of the human. Many would agree that describing Palestinians as human animals is a dehumanizing practice that, as we know, has a long colonial history. Liberal humanism's response to the Palestinian dehumanization is frequently to call for empathy. Such an approach paints the Palestinian as victims and begins to ask if we should consider the Israeli military as their victimizer, right? The major challenge. But we can see that Palestinians now have begun to be perceived as the victim of victims, as Edward Said puts it in The Question of Palestine. Empathy humanizes Palestinians, and there are concrete and pragmatic benefits to being humanized. People who are moved by Palestinian suffering can march for a ceasefire in Gaza and vaguely argue for a two-state solution. So the ability to empathize with Palestinians has been a positive change for Palestinians. For really the first time, it has become possible for a growing number of Westerners to view Palestinians as capable of being wronged, as suffering and injustice at the hands of Israel and its Western sponsors. At the same time, the image of the victim, the rhetoric of the victim, should also give us pause. Why is it that most people can stand with Palestinians only when they're dead or dying? The pathos of suffering is powerful, and yet, as Saidiya Hartman reminds us, the same pathos also forecloses other possibilities. By imaginatively transporting ourselves into the assumed position of Gazans, we might feel moral indignation and repulsion at the occupation, and yet, is there an actual recognition of the displaced and starving Palestinian? Liberals may humanize Palestinians, but at what cost? Liberals evacuate Palestinian alterity, the specificity of the situation, unintentionally relegating Palestinian objection to the position of the colonial unthoughts. By means of a contrast with another ongoing war, the war in Ukraine, we, the Western world, can empathize with the suffering of Ukrainian civilians, but can also, without tension or contradiction, identify with their struggle for liberation. In the West, we seem to have no trouble viewing Ukrainians as both victims and freedom fighters, struggling against an imperialist Russia. What prevents this analogous situation for the Palestinian struggle? I think there are many factors involved, but the one I would like to emphasize here is the settler colonial context and its politics of the human. This framing of the antagonism is still foreign to Western liberals, who tend to see what is happening in Palestine-Israel as a fundamentally de-racialized conflict over territory. Identifying with the Palestinian cause with a struggle against a racist settler colonial state puts front and center the struggle for liberation, which itself is tied to sovereignty over land. Western leaders recognize that they are directly implicated in this form of critique, while liberals at large can still feign ignorance. Palestinians as freedom fighters recenters the settler colonial situation. It troubles precisely the liberal attachment to humanitarian reason, and here anti-colonial reason points elsewhere. So the last point, subsection, disavow in crisis. Benjamin Netanyahu's nationalist government is redefining the right at home and abroad. Unleashed, it is no longer giving the appearance of playing by the rules that one would expect liberal democracies to adhere to. The Israeli government transgresses national and international laws, from its judicial coup in Israel to its terror-inducing raids in the occupied West Bank and the genocidal campaign in Gaza. Netanyahu's fascist coalition is not only making its Western supporters uncomfortable, it is also, and more importantly, exposing the illiberal and eliminationist core of Israeli politics. This elimination score is precisely what the opposition between political Zionism and liberal Zionism works tirelessly to obfuscate. So I want to briefly talk about political Zionism's cannibalization of its liberal twin, attending to the ways it has rendered inoperative the fetishist disavowal that keeps liberal Zionists and Western powers more or less content with the status quo, that is, with the occupation on cruise control. To put it mildly, the Netanyahu's government's crudeness and brutality is making Western powers look bad. It is committing the type of violence that international law was supposed to prevent. Western powers prefer an Israeli government tethered to the logic of fetishist disavowal. The formula for fetishist disavowal, as Octave Amanouni defines it, is je sais bien, mais quand même. I know very well, but all the same. This logic accounts for the manner a belief can be abandoned and preserved at the same time. We can formulate this liberal Zionist fetishist disavowal in the following way. We know very well that we must reach a compromise with the Palestinian, that we can't be seen as an apartheid state. All the same, we believe in Israel's unique claim to be at once democratic and Jewish. Or we might put it in a way that foregrounds the basic distinction between oppressor and oppressed. I know very well the Palestinians are subjugated by an occupying force, but all the same, I don't believe it to be fruitful to dwell on a settler colonial context and elevate the actions of Hamas. Cecilia bin Habib formulates this version of the disavowal. Israel's uniqueness, its ability to be both Jewish and democratic, is the fetish of liberal Zionism. Knowledge about the occupation, even knowledge of the International Courts of Justice ruling, does not upset your social identity nor the coordinates of the existing system. But things might be changing. Liberals in Israel have been severely critical of Netanyahu and his far-right coalition. Israeli sociologist Eva Eells, who publishes fairly frequently in the Haaretz, has drawn powerful analogies between America's treatment of slaves and Israel's treatment of Palestinians. I quote from a 2014 article titled 47 Years a Slave, A New Perspective on the Occupation. She says, quote, what started as a national and military conflict has morphed into a form of domination of Palestinians that now increasingly borders on conditions of slavery, end quote. Linking slavery with the occupation is a powerful analogy and a disconcerting one for Zionists of all shades. We can even see Eells as attempting to unsettle the social coordinates of her fellow Israelis so that the knowledge of the inhumane occupation is not simply contained and rendered toothless, but might become life or world altering. After October 7th, one might have expected Eells to pursue further her analogy in the vein of Norman Finkelstein, who dared to compare Hamas's attack to a slave revolt exemplified by the enslaved Nat Turner's revolt in Southampton, Virginia in 1831, which, quote, killed a lot of white people, civilians in a rampage, end quote. The point here is that butchery is met with butchery, and butchery is met again with even greater butchery. But Eells doesn't follow Finkelstein. She goes the opposite direction and unleashes her ire on the global left. Eells makes axiomatic that the evil of Hamas has no context and undertakes to save the universalist left from its post-colonial hijacking. Much of Eells' argument against leftists relies on a familiar pattern of objections leveled at the pro-Palestinian left, the embodiment of an alleged new anti-Semitism. She objects to the singling out of Israel for its nationalism. Let's call it the why you're picking a Zionism argument. And the left's failure to stand to Islam's abuses. Let's call it the why are you defending the indefensible arguments. The Hamas attack and its reception among leftist circles crystallized for Eells what she calls the left's, quote, moral and intellectual bankruptcy. Why? Because the global left has failed to stand with Israel. Leftists unforgivably turn their care towards the Palestinian population. The titles of her articles take on an increasingly alarmist and accusatory form, from the global left's reaction to October 7th, threatens to the fight against the occupation, which was published November 11th, 2023, to how the left became a politics of hatred against Jews, February 3rd, 2024. In these articles, Eells seeks to delegitimize the global left, first by charging its champions, including Judith Butler and Slavoj Žižek, with anti-Semitism, and second, by moving to post-colonize the left, that is, to expunge its interpretive biases when it comes to Palestine, Israel. Eells indicates her disdain of post-colonial studies by putting quotation marks around post-colonial left. And she relies on Aviad Kleinberg to take down post-colonial theory. Kleinberg's article, Are all Israeli colonialists who deserve to die?" echoes the contemptuous tone of Eells' writing. For Kleinberg, post-colonial theory has bewitched today's readers. Its excessive skepticism negates all the gains of a more nuanced account of received knowledge. According to Kleinberg's distorted vision, post-colonial induced skepticism has given way to self-righteous dogmatism, where a Manichaean logic prevails. Quote, "The West is the victimizer and everyone else is a victim," end quote. Such selective vision, Kleinberg argues, warns, simplifies global matters. While casting herself as a defender of the Enlightenment values and invested in forging a just peace between Palestinians and Israelis, Eells was distraught by the left's insistence that Hamas's attack did not materialize out of thin air. The belief that Hamas's brutal assault did not occur in a vacuum was itself read as an anti-Semitic observation, insofar as the condemnation of Hamas was qualified by the impulse to understand the attack. Offended by this line of argumentation, Eells intervenes in a moralizing attempt to shame the global left and set straight its path, which again has been derailed by post-colonial theory. Eells ironically ends up in Netanyahu's camp, the anti-colonial left as an anti-Semitic left, which is what Netanyahu has been saying all along. The possibility to engage with the Palestinian question to get her liberal Israeli audience to think more critically about the monster that is the occupation is foreclosed. Worse, Eells suspends critical theory in the name of bearing witness to the suffering of Jews. All of her work in making Palestinian misery visible to Israelis goes to waste. What ultimately matters is not Palestinian lives. October 7th was a day for Jews and only for Jews. Critical theory, in its hunger to understand the situation, in its refusal to accept the image of Palestinians as intrinsically anti-Semitic and barbaric, betrayed the Jewish people. So here I see Eells as symptomatic of a cultural shift. A fetishist disavowal is no longer seems to be operational. I know very well about Palestinian misery, but all the same, I believe in Israel's universal aspiration. I believe in an Israel after Netanyahu. Now becomes, I know very well about Palestinian misery, but all the same, I don't care. When it comes to traumas, my kin comes first. Ultra-nationalism is a form of tribalism. The Shoah on October 7th, Trump, the Nakba, and the occupation. Ultra-nationalism does not need fetishist disavowal to sustain its operation, whereas liberal Zionism needs it desperately to sustain its life. So how do we react? I think critical theory should welcome this development. The false choice between political religious Zionism and liberal cultural Zionism was always an ideological opposition, a ruse that makes liberals feel good about their support for a genocidal state. For Palestinians and their supporters, this choice has always been between a muscular expansionist Zionism on the one hand and an anti-colonial struggle on the other. It is up to the rest of the world now to take their stance.
Thank you so much, Zahi. This was really two great presentations and a lot of food for thought. We have now opened the floor for questions, but I wanted to start by asking, I mean, post-colonial theory has been growing in universities, specifically in the West, in many cases, mainly paying lip service. And we've seen with the start of the genocide how, I mean, it's mainly critical theorists who teach these things that, found it very difficult to take a clear position vis-a-vis Palestine. And I think that at the core of this is the position regarding revolutionary violence, and the fact that today we live in a world where the very concept of revolutionary violence is very quickly accused of being terrorism, a world where the oppressed is not expected or imagined to even have the ability to rise against the oppressed, and as you're saying, against the oppressor. The analogy with slaves, the analogy with oppression throughout history is very useful here. And we have recently seen theorists like Judith Butler, who recently, just I think last week, talked about Hamas as a resistance movement, but was very quick to then say that she disagrees with the tactic, but we should begin by accepting that this is resistance. So I wanted to hear from you, based on both approaches to this question. What space is there today to think about revolutionary violence? And what spaces has Palestine specifically reopened for us to imagine or reimagine this word? I mean, a word of, very entrenched neoliberalism, and a word where, and as much as we think there's disavowal, there's, movements and revolutions are hard, but they keep occurring. So how do we grapple with this?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for this question. That's why I prefer anti-colonial rather than post-colonial when describing the kind of resistance that is emerging in Palestine. And I mean, the problem here is you want to be effective in your violence. And Hamas becomes an example that any form of violence, anything that would shake the Zionist regime, its functioning, is called anti-Semitic. And you can make distinctions. Going after civilians is a violation of international law, but you also have the right to resist your occupier. So this, Israel's right of self-defense is not enshrined as an occupying force. So there's that. We have to kind of clarify what are we objecting to here? Are we objecting of Palestinians killing civilians or just striking at the Israeli military? And second, with Butler and others, nonviolence is a kind of privilege to only go the nonviolence approach. So they may differ with Hamas's tactics, and that's fine. But let's recognize that, if somebody has their boot on your neck, nonviolence may not be an immediate response. But I think ultimately the kind of physical violence and nonviolence has to be kind of troubled. For example, the boycott, divestment, sanction movement is very much violent. It is trying to delegitimize an occupier, an apartheid regime, a genocidal regime. There's violence in dismantling this kind of pristine vision of Israel as a liberal democracy, as a quasi-European nation. So for me, what is the most effective impacts? And all significant impacts would be at a profound level violence. So if you go the non-violent path, right? BDS is not armed struggle, but it is perceived as a threat. That's why it's also anti-Semitic in the eyes of many supporters of Israel.
Maybe I can jump in here in two parts. I just want to say one thing about post-colonial theory. I mean, again, Butler's not a post-colonial theorist, but so I had written about this many years ago, but not specifically with reference to post-colonial theory. And then Ann Stoller's recent book, duress talks about this. The thing about post-colonial theory is, right, it was born out of Edward Said's his work. And what she argues is what happened with post-colonial theory and post-colonial studies is it refused to read, what her argument is, it refused to read the question of Palestine together with Orientalism. So it severed the question of Palestine and contemporary imperialism from his project. I mean, you don't have to read the question of Palestine. The last third of the book is about post-war, post-Second World War US imperialism and Israel. And so post-colonial theory really abandoned, it really looked at empires of old, the French, the British primarily, in North America, German to some extent, but it really abandoned the entire thinking about imperialism as an enduring form and American imperialism and then the contemporary, right? I think that is shattering. It's not just October 7th. There's certainly been much more conversation among historians and anthropologists who are post-colonial, who would consider themselves post-colonial about Palestine in the last decade and a half, I would say. And then October 7th kind of really, there's much more political involvement. Because I think in some ways what happened in post-colonial theory was Said's politics got bottomed out. It became a kind of theory that circulates in the American Academy where theory stands in for politics. So that's one thing. The question of violence, I guess, no, I think there isn't, I guess the question is where, but that's right. I think there isn't the same possibility for recognizing revolutionary violence as there was in the 50s and 60s, right? And then Israel and Palestine pose a particular problem because the colonial state is framed as the victim. But I guess I think, frame my answer a little differently than Zahi, sort of the opposite. So I don't think the question is that we have to rethink violence because BDS is violence. I think the question actually is there's no form of Palestinian resistance that has never been labeled as violent, right? Whether it's Fidei in the 50s and 60s and the hijackings, okay, and then the first Intifada has been turned into like a violent revolution and BDS is violent. The Israeli state considered until October 7th, no doubt, the BDS was the second most serious security threat to the state of Israel, and the first was Iran getting a nuclear weapon. The point is, anything is going to be labeled, and by violence they mean anti-Semitic and terrorist, right? Because it's about there's no legitimate form of Palestinian resistance. So I think there's no resistance that would ever be recognized as violent. And it's not just Israel that's gone after BDS in that way. I don't know what percent, but a large percentage of US states have laws against BDS. So you have to start with the politics. The politics are unrecognizable or illegitimate. So any form of resistance then gets labeled violent and anti-Semitic.
But I think what worries greatly, supporters of Israel is there is a kind of shift among generations. A younger generations actually is accepting BDS and its framing of reality. This terrifies supporters of Israel because eventually they're going to be voting for politicians. And so, the label of anti-Semitism is not as effective at the level of grassroots. Our students are not buying it. And you're calling people, you call out their hypocrisy. You're against armed struggle. Okay, then you should support, right, a non-violent, physically violent, killing people option, and you don't. And in America, you have this amazing legislation against critical race theory and BDS. Liberals reject the right's attempt to pass anti-CRT legislation, but there's a pure agreement that anti-BDS is the way to go. So here there's a kind of exposure to the liberal position that has to be, in a sense, dismantled. There's no really a liberal position anymore that is meaningful and is actually changing the world. So I think you have a consolidation around the kind of right vision of reality, and we have to develop an alternative. The alternative, I think, has to emerge out of an anti-colonial understanding of the world that fights against settler colonialism, that stresses a universalist solidarity movement behind it. And I think, Palestine is doing this. Black Palestinian solidarity is back on people's horizon. And this also terrifies people because everybody becomes anti-Semitic. The UN is anti-Semitic. BLM activists are anti-Semitic. Indigenous groups are anti-Semitic. Everybody's anti-Semitic. And at some level, it doesn't stick anymore.
Can I just say one more thing about revolutionary violence quickly? I mean, I also think the flip side is, not the Butler flip side, but, October 7th was undoubtedly a revolutionary moment, whatever that means, right? But I also think we don't know, what, okay. I also think there's a kind of romance of revolutionary violence that we have to think about, because what are conditions under which you can actually change the conditions on the ground in your favor and not? And it's not clear what's going to, I mean, look, right now it's clear that it became, I mean, look, I think the Israeli state has for years now been looking for an opportunity to ethnically transfer people out, and that became the opportunity. So it's not that Hamas brought it into being, it's like this has been on the table. And it became, so we're in the middle of a genocide. We don't know, revolutionary violence can also fail. And I think we have to take that seriously as a possibility. I'm not saying there's therefore a nonviolent alternative. I'm just saying there's a whole romance and all sorts. There's a romance and there's a rejection, but anyway, whatever.
Okay, we have 3 questions. The first one is from Nasser Jabi. It's in Arabic, but I'll try to translate. So he says, the picture you've presented about the position from vis-a-vis Israel is correct, but things have changed a lot since the start of the genocide, specifically in the West. So he's wondering whether you can talk a bit more about these transformations and how it will, in the future, shape Western societies, specifically societies that are taking a critical position regarding the Israeli state and army.
I mean, I can start, if I say, it is, yes. I mean, the kind of, again, the global order is the global order, but the powers that matter in this case, and in many cases, is sort of the Euro-American world. I mean, there's been extraordinary opposition on the streets, and I don't think this is a flash in the pants. There's a real generational divide. It's true in US politics, it's true throughout Europe on Palestine, and in the US on many, many issues. The Trump Republicans, the whole party has become Trump, right, is much older, much whiter. The white population in America, in the US is going to be a minority by 2030 something, right? So I think we are in, I think there are 2 things. One, we are in a generational shift, which I agree, but I think that's why the crackdown is so hysterical, right? Both Congress, but also the moneyed elite. The issue is it is not shifting in the hands of the powers that be. So over time, things are going to shift, but I see it as, decades of a struggle, not tomorrow. The other thing is there's some shifting, of course, because this is the first genocide that has been televised live for all practical purposes. I mean, not on television, but on social media. And this is where you can hold 2 things together. I think there are people, believe me, I've had to deal with them, who won't even recognize, or they'll say, yeah, people are dying, but it's, there's no empathy there. It's like Hamas's fault. But I think, liberal subjects struggle with slaughter, and they struggle with babies dying of starvation. But, the move from there to doing what it would take to stop this war, I don't see happening. They have to literally cut off weapons and cut off economic ties. I mean, even just think the starvation going on in Gaza. The US could pull a military ship up to the shores of Gaza, deliver aid, and in fact could put military hospitals there. The Israelis are not going to shoot at them, right? But that kind of defiance of the state right? And or cut off, it's just something that is not politically going to happen. And partly that is because of really a kind of deep-seated older generation that are true believers in Zionism. And it's partly the structure of American politics, which is about money and interests. And it's partly about the Republican Party that is using anti-Semitism, about which they care absolutely not, because they're a bunch of, like, you want anti-Semites, let's go to the base of the Republican Party. But they can use it as a cudgel against liberal elites and split the elite around this issue. So I do think things are changing, but I'm not convinced. I don't see any radical action, which I think is what would be required to break the siege, stop the genocide, and stop the starvation, even though it's in the US's hands. I mean, it wouldn't be that hard, right? I don't know, is that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can talk about, the changes happening within Israel. So recently, I taught the interview with Levinas after the Sabra and Shatila massacres, and of the early 80s, where Levinas was kind of stressing the importance of ethical Zionism versus the political Zionism and its efficiency in the Begin's government. And part of what keeps ethical Zionism alive was the 300,000 people protesting in Tel Aviv about Israel's failure to stop the Phalangists from massacring Palestinians since it was occupying Lebanon. There's nothing like 300,000 Israeli Jews protesting against the genocide. They're for it. And if you have a mindset that is fully endorsing this annihilation of people who are just next to you, it doesn't bode well for a future of any kind of coexistence between the two people. So there's a change to the hard right in Israel when it comes to Palestinians. They can have democracy, marches for democracy with tens of thousands. Occupation is never an agenda item for them. So, I think the civilians in Israel, there's no march on Tel Aviv to change Israel's attitude towards Palestinians. They also want to finish them is also the Israeli narrative dealing with Palestinians, and it's generalizable, right? The crazy settler, the wild settler, the unruly settler is the obscene underside of every single Israeli who accepts the occupation, right? It makes it explicit now. It's no longer just the wild hooligan settlers. They're an expression of Israel's political vision and treatment of Palestinians.
Yeah, and this is what the polls show very clearly since the start of this genocide. There are two questions that I'll read together because they're more linked to discussing the actual political position of states. So Muhammad Shahnawaz is asking, to what extent do you think the US will go and support Israel and keep ignoring reports of its own established organizations to run the New World Order? And there's another question in Arabic from Abdel Wahab Janad, who's asking about what are some possible propositions in the future to avoid a human catastrophe like this one. And he specifically is talking about famine in Gaza and the responsibility of or the centrality of Rafah specifically at this point. So I think these two questions can be answered together, and then we'll do another round of questions that are more about theory.
I mean, for me, Biden now is floating this idea of a two-state solution. So it was for 30 years under far better conditions. It led nowhere. It led to more displacement of Palestinians, more illegal settlements. So this kind of nostalgia for a two-state solution is perverse. It's incredible that he's getting away with it by reimposing it. I mean, Said criticized the Oslo Accords before the ink was dry. He saw it as a complete imbalance of perspectives, what the Palestinians recognize a Jewish state and what Israel recognized PLO as a representative of the Palestinians is it was clear where this was going to end up. So Mahmoud Abbas will be squeezed to accept some kind of deal, at least some kind of vision of a two-state solution that will resemble models that were, put forward in South Africa that the South Africans rejected. So I think, Biden is going to be a huge problem for Palestinians. Trump is not going to be any better. But how does the political culture of America understand that Palestinians and their cause can't be ignored? Unfortunately, in this cycle, it may not actually have the kind of material effect that Nadia was predicting. That's not going to have that effect. But you will have to wait 4 more years after that and see if there's a lesson among Democrats, Democratic leaders, that you can't ignore this growing section of the American public. But the two-state solution, in a sense, has to be scrutinized. You have to constantly remind them. How about the laws, the resolution already passed? How about the right of return? I mean, this is the first thing that will get sacrificed in a two-state solution. And this inability to see Israel as a settled colonial state. Netanyahu should be behind bars, right? There should be pressure on this war criminal. Right now, we're trying to appease him. The government, Western governments, are trying to appease him and make him like comfortable, and but there should be language of sanctioning Israel, which is not really on the agenda of any European nation, except maybe Ireland.
Spain.
Yeah, I was in Spain. Yeah. So first part, how far will the US go? First of all, we're in an election year. And so everything that's playing out is also about the election. But ironically, Biden is likely going to lose the election over Gaza. That's the generational shift. But I also don't see him and I really think Biden is a true believer in Zionism. But I also think the humanitarian crisis, I mean, I love how it's not named a genocide, it's named a humanitarian crisis. It doesn't bother him, he's also a good Catholic. But I just don't see him. I mean, so in some sense, you could make an argument that it's an election year and he's going to lose the election because of this. So maybe the strategic thing would be to move. But the donor class, he would lose the election if he did the opposite. So how far is the US willing to go? I think it's going to try to, do what it's doing now, which is keep shipping weapons and saying, oh my God, and dropping 38,000 meals from the sky, which is absurd. I mean, they're sort of involved in a PR attempt rather than anything. I think their solution is, everyone's fixated on this as a problem of Netanyahu. It's not a problem of Netanyahu. In fact, I have a different reading of Israeli liberals, I think, than Zahi did. I think this is a kind of cost and disavowal that predates October 7th. It's just now they're willing to say it out loud. And I think what the Biden administration is dying for is for Netanyahu to be forced out. So there's a new leader, and then they can pretend like it makes a difference. But, there's a consensus they're going to, quote unquote, finish the job, right? How they finish the job, do they do it slowly? I mean, so I don't think that's going to change. I don't even particularly engage the conversation about a two-state solution because I don't think anybody's serious anyway, even about that. Like, they have to be saying something now, right? And Saudi Arabia I mean, we want to talk about a solution. I mean, the Arabs could step in, but it's never going to happen. You need some kind of a rhetorical out, both for the US and for all the Arab regimes that have or want to, quote unquote, normalize with Israel. It's not going to go anywhere. At best, Saudi Arabia is going to sign an agreement that says, we'll sign this because you're going to create a state. That will never happen. And what are the possibilities of avoiding a humanitarian disaster? I mean, we're actually in one, obviously. I mean, the only way to stop this is to actually end the war and break the siege. And at the moment, there really seems no realistic option or possibility of that happening. I think we're in for, they're in for a really long, horrifying siege that will be more kinetically violent at certain moments and less like out and out kinetically violent at other moments, but it's just going to endure. I mean, the Israelis are saying it's a couple-year project, right? And what they really want to do, I mean, they've done it. They're flattening the strip so that even if they don't force people into Egypt, even if that doesn't materialize, nobody's going home. Nobody's going back to the north. They've already built a highway splitting the north from the south. They've already created a buffer zone several kilometers all the way around the edge. What they're going to do is pen people into a smaller and smaller zone. It's ethnic cleansing within the strip, right? So whatever two-state solution means, then it's also what, like a quarter of the strip now? Anyway, I don't know. I wish I had the imagination for an exit strategy that was realistic, but I don't see it right now.
Okay, it's now 3 questions that I'll read together because I think they're connected. So Soha Bayoumi is saying that her internet cut off when we were talking about post-colonial, anti-colonial theory. But so she says, my question is related to decolonial theory and whether you think it holds promise for the Palestinian cause. Many indigenous movements around the world have espoused decolonial as opposed to post-colonial theory, partly because the colonization is ongoing. What are the promises and challenges for theorists of Palestine to engage seriously with decolonial theory? Another question from Elizabeth Suzanne Kassab is what new opportunities, in your opinion, have the gaps of critical theories during this Gaza moment opened for perhaps a new critique? And I'll read those with a question from Nawar Al-Husari, who thanks you both, Professor El-Haj and Professor Zalloua, for comprehensive and intense presentations. And there are 2 questions. The first one is, I would love to hear from you more about your opinion about the role of new means of media in providing massive amounts of material to enrich and form a counter anti-colonial discourse and understanding and shaping new narratives amongst new audience, not only from the region, I think in the West or the global North. And the second question is also maybe elaborating on the capacities of critical theory and questioning the terms and language that basically form the collective memory and even maybe a big part of social identity here in the West. So I guess these are all questions about the openings, possibilities of decolonial, anti-colonial versus post-colonial, but also critical theory, social media, and the Gaza moment.
Okay. So the post-colonial framing here can stand for many things. The way Eva Illouz was evoking it, it's just the kind of Western subject is bad, the rest of the world is good. That's what post-colonial theory becomes reduced to, this kind of binarism. And this could apply to anti-colonial thinkers and decolonial thinkers in that framework. My personal reservations about a kind of decolonial model is, we're dealing with other factors in this world. I'm dissatisfied with like Walter Mignolo's vision of how do you deal with global capitalism, this idea that you can de-link from Western nations and relink to your own pre-colonial culture. I think downplays the incursion and the reach of global capitalism. If there's going to be a Palestinian state, some kind of Palestinian sovereignty, I think questions of class struggle, resistance to neoliberalization has to be front and center. And I think the decolonial route ignores all of this. An anti-colonial investment that is also universalist in its orientation. And here I'm thinking of Fanon as our nice kind of model for what anti-colonial resistance looks like, that doesn't give up on class struggle, that doesn't give up on a kind of universalist reach that connects Palestine to other regions in the world, other sites of resistance against this kind of, what Achille Mbembe talks about, the becoming black of the world, or the Gazifications of the world. I think Palestine will play, should play, must play a crucial role in the future politics, a future horizon.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So decolonial theory. I agree. Well, I agree with much of what you said, Zahi. I would add a few things. One is, in terms of decolonial theory, I think there's decolonial theory done well. And then there's a lot of decolonial theory that I, as an anthropologist, feel like we've gone back to primitivism, right? There isn't a prior that can be recaptured here. And so one really has to work through what it means to think about alterity and difference without going back to what is ultimately a kind of culturalist argument that there are these essences that can be recaptured. Things can be recombined, they can be reiterated, but they can't be recaptured, hundreds and hundreds of years into sort of global capitalism and colonialism. But more specifically to Palestine, look, I'm all for these comparative conversations, whether it's comparative settler colonialisms and with indigenous studies, et cetera. But I do think what's happened in some Palestine studies is it's almost taking it hook, line, and sinker. That there are profound differences between the histories of settler colonialism in Canada and Australia and the US, which tends to be the model, and Israel. First of all, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire. So why aren't we talking about peasantries, right? I mean, the issue is going back to indigenous alterities, but really you got to think about whatever that relationship to the land is, the appropriation from indigeneity, I don't think is the right one. So it was part of this huge empire, right, et cetera, et cetera. But also the temporality is different. The US and Canada and Australia are settler nations that are very settled. I mean, it doesn't mean all struggles are over, but nothing's settled in Israel. We don't know what the borders are. We don't know who the citizens are, right? We don't even know what the definition, I mean, they're still fighting over the definition of who is a Jew, for God's sake. And it's still at a moment where out and out war is the way that the conflict is dealt with, right? So, and it's also, by the way, and it's also a moment where revolution remains at least a possibility, right? What's happened in indigenous politics, Audrey Simpson, who's a brilliant colleague of mine, talks about the politics of refusal, and Palestinians have picked up, but refusal really is about a certain moment where the idea of a radical break of the state itself as a radical break is not on the table in the same way that it is in Palestine. So I think that one needs to think across these terms, and comparatively, but one also has to think really specifically about Israel. And on the one hand, everyone wants to de-exceptionalize Israel, and I agree on some level. But on the other hand, I think one has to be very careful about the complicated ways in which it normalizes Israel the way they want to be normalized. We're just like these other liberal settler, they won't say it, democracies where everybody has their race problems and you have your quote unquote Indian problem, right? But no, it's a different kind of state in the early 21st century. And it's an active colonial state that is still trying to settle its borders and still trying to expel populations, indigenous populations, et cetera, and is still, carrying out a genocide, right? And I think we have to not play into it just becoming another liberal Western state with all its contradictions, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I feel like we're losing sight of that a little bit. The media stuff, I guess we can talk about. I mean, obviously, this is live streamed because people are live streaming it themselves, right? And I think that has had an extraordinary impact. But I also think it's worth keeping in mind if you think about, the Syrian revolution, right? There was this faith that you live stream this alternative narrative and some political response will come of it. It's not clear. I mean, as people have argued, Lisa Wedeen argues this in her book. I can't remember the title of the recent book, but, in fact, what it's created, authoritarian apprehensions, is that right? Yeah. What it's created in the context of Syria is doubt, right? Like you're saturated all the stuff and you have this video and that video and who knows if it's true. I mean, it can create political conviction, but it can also create a kind of alibi for doubt. Well, we don't really know, right? I mean, that's what's happened with the El-Haj hospital thing. Well, we don't really know, right? We have the Israeli videos, we have the other videos, we have people reading them. So on the one hand, I think it's had an important impact at a kind of popular level, again, of a certain generation, but how that translates. So nobody's going to be able to turn back in 20, 30 years and say, we did not know. That is not an option, right? But we know we can see it and we're going to do something about it. We can see it and we believe it, et cetera, are different questions. What are we really seeing, right? I mean, we get a lot of that in the States. What are we really seeing? Oh, they're fake videos. Oh, right. They're staged, et cetera, et cetera.
Or I mean, the way Biden initially questioned the amount of people dying, these figures, oh, this is coming from Hamas, so already kind of skepticism. I think now that didn't really work. People still were following the numbers, and most likely it's far greater with everybody who's buried under the rubble. I mean, for me, the settled colonial framework still works. It works in a sense in a more efficient way than looking at Canada, United States, insofar as you're still seeing the founding violence happening in front of your eyes. You still have Palestinians who are older than the Israeli state. So, and they would love to have a founding violence that solidifies the nation state of Israel, like other, France has a horrible history of founding violence. But nobody questions the origins of France, really. Israel would love to be in that position, but Palestinians are refusing just to disappear and having that founding violence be fully naturalized. So I think the settled colonial narrative is useful precisely for that reason, that the sheer existence of Palestinian becomes a form of resistance. And, the best part of a kind of decolonial model here is that you draw back from your culture in that you're not disappearing. It's a response to your erasure. Palestinian people don't exist, right, as a culture. So culture here plays a nice confrontation with the vision of that, they're not Palestinians, they're Arabs, they could go anywhere. The problem with that is, you have this kind of moralizing image of Palestinians as a culture, the culturalist argument that you were making, Nadia. And I think that has to be supplemented in a kind of Derridian sense, that with a framework of refusal or resistance to an occupier. And that's what's missing. And I think even among grassroots, people, walk, protest Israel's genocide, but it's still very much as victims. And it's a war it's a battle that has to be made to be potentially see the Israeli as the victimizer. But until you see them as freedom fighters at some profound level, like Ukrainians, you can feel sympathy, empathy for Ukrainians and still not negate their right to resist an occupying force, Russia. But with Palestinians, that second part is absent. In part, there is a kind of deep fear in the West about brown bodies taking arms, right? Ukrainians are Europeans, right? They're more European now, so they can struggle with violence. But Palestinians, no, it makes people uncomfortable. I mean, yeah, it makes people uncomfortable in France with its black and beurre problem, and even Canada, right? The Canada as a kind of the kinder settler colonial state is also being challenged by indigenous critics, that this model of liberalism, of inclusion, accommodation is not working anymore. And there's a challenge in thinking, beyond resistance and refusal. But maybe, Palestinians should adopt a politics of refusal when you're handed the two-state solution, and not play that game that's going to produce another 30 years of misery with no responses, no real change in the material condition.
Great. There's a question from an anonymous attendee that says, I don't know if this is an appropriate question to ask here, but I'd love to hear what you think of the recent piece in the London Review of Books by Pankaj Mishra, if you've read it. And this is, I think, the article entitled The Shoah After Gaza.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've read it.
I read it 2 days ago, late at night. It's a kind of tracing of the story of how Holocaust survivors, and because I work on Jean Améry, that was nice. I was able to kind of follow the importance of Améry, who was a great figure of ressentiment, like kind of life-affirming ressentiment, which basically was telling the German society, I'm not going to forget and forgive, insisting on the painful past. So that was a night that I was always attracted to, this vision of ressentiment as a resistance to let's play nice, let's move forward, let's put the history behind us. But then Améry became a fantastic supporter of the Zionist project, that he thought only Israel can stop the next Auschwitz, which he called an Uber Auschwitz. And the article was pointing that towards the end of his life, he saw how the Israeli government, Menachem Begin, was torturing Palestinians. And somebody who survived torture said, if Israel continues in that path, it's not going to end well for Israel. But he became, in a sense, for me, the model of what supporters of Israel have coined, the kind of new anti-Semitism. An anti-Semitism that comes from people who fight against racism, that comes from the left. Bernard-Henri Lévy made that argument, but it comes even earlier with Jean Améry. So tracking how these survivors and their attitude towards Israel, I think, is useful. At the very least, it points to, just because you suffered, it's not going to make you a moral person. And chances are it's going to be the opposite. You're going to be hardened. You're going to refuse to be seen as a victimizer. And I think Nadia was talking about this, about the Shoah, the role of the Shoah and Jacqueline Rose talks about this, how the Shoah becomes constitutive of Israeli identity. And it's hard to live with this vision of this pain, so it has to be released, and it's released on its Palestinian neighbor. And in Germany, the Holocaust becomes constitutive of German identity. So if you go after Israelis, if you go against Israeli Jews, against Israel's right to exist, then you're questioning what redeems Germany, right? The Holocaust and the way it stands with Israel redeems Germany. So to go after Israel is to go after Germany's place, among Western nations. So there's a lot of sucking investment in Israel because it's linked very much to a narcissistic Germany that wants to see itself as good.
I read the first half so far and thought it was good. Look, it's an LRB piece. I think it's interesting. He doesn't engage at all, at least as far as I got. Palestinians have thought about the Shoah and the Holocaust, and he doesn't engage that conversation, but I think it's not addressed to us, right? Mm-hmm. And I think him sort of narrating himself out of a Hindu nationalist origin is sort of interesting. So I actually, as far as I got, I thought it was a very good piece, but the audience is very particular, I would say.
I think building on this discussion, Aday Al-Muhsin is saying, thanks for this great panel. Do you think that never again, which is arguably an adaptation of Adorno's categorical imperative, and what should be interpreted as a universal call to redirect all thoughts so that Auschwitz never repeats itself, so that nothing similar ever happens again, has not only been de-universalized and exclusivized, but has effectively become a call for legitimizing murdering and starving Palestinians en masse. It seems to me that never again, at this moment, is effectuated at the cost of Gazan flesh, bones, and blood. And blood the bones in the West, especially Germany and the US, is more than willing to appease Israel's genocidal campaign in the name of this slogan and this now twisted and hollowed out categorical imperative. I just would like to hear your thoughts on how could never again be universalized to include Palestinians and all oppressed peoples. I think, Nadia, this is related to what you were discussing in your intervention.
I think, so if you read, I think there were these different moments, right? So Peter Novick's book, The Holocaust in American Life, traces the ways in which that never again comes to be. So he goes through sort of the 70s, through the 90s, the Bosnian genocide, Rwanda, et cetera. And the question of, on the one hand, never again is supposed to be universalized. And on the other hand, it becomes almost paralytic because every conversation is, well, is it as bad as the Holocaust? But, you get into the sort of, post-Soviet, post-Cold War moment. And if you haven't, whoever's asking this question, if you haven't read it, Robert Meister's book, After Evil, is really an amazing book about reading what he calls the new human rights regime, right? So the right to protect, the responsibility to protect, right? The whole sort of between the Cold War and 9/11, the language of intervention of the US and NATO and the West was, of course, that if the 20th century is the century of the Holocaust, as in genocide, this has to be the century of never again, in the sense we have to stop evil before it occurs, right? And so there are all these interventions, military interventions, in the name of human rights and humanitarianism. 9/11, I think, shifts that dramatically. I mean, although somehow this literature doesn't recognize that, but letting that go. But now this is, never again, we have to stop evil before it persists. But when it gets to the Jewish state, it hits this blockage. I do want to say that that's one of the things being fought over. I mean, I guess one thing I realized I just want to emphasize for people in the region, the Middle East, is when I talk about the generational divide in the US, it's profoundly within the Jewish community. And so what's happening on campuses actually is the vast majority of Jewish students are anti-Zionists. And what they're saying, and in these national groups, there is not in my name. Never again means never again for everyone or for anyone, and not in my name. So I think that on the one hand, of course, this is a moment in which that call has been like reappropriated. I mean, it never was totally unappropriated, but in this profound ethno-nationalist racist sense. And of course, that's how October 7th was portrayed, the largest killing of Jews since the Holocaust. I mean, even if that's numerically true, it's an absurd statement. I'm sorry, like 1,100 versus what? What was the smallest number since in the Holocaust? 10,000 a day, 20,000 a day? I mean, it's absurd, but it's precisely reinstating that. And that phrase is being fought over. But yeah, it's being weaponized, but it's the object of dispute within the Jewish community. And again, part of what's happening is, parents saying, I don't recognize my kid. I can't believe my kid is demonstrating for Gazans and against the Israeli state. But yeah, never again is being used by the Israeli state and its supporters as if it only applies to Jews.
And I mean, the Jewish voice for peace has been amazing in precisely resisting this very narcissistic never again that only applies to Israel, and has been pushing to have that horizon apply to Palestinians. And you also have, in the previous Gaza war, you had Holocaust survivors contesting Netanyahu's use of never again back then. So you have a kind of critique from actual survivors of the Holocaust and a younger generation. And again, this troubles Israeli supporters because they can't rely on a previous homogeneity in the Jewish position vis-a-vis Israel. I mean, I think this gap is only going to increase.
Okay. There's a question by Eileen Kutab that says, don't you think that the transformations in the global order and the gradual collapse of neoliberalism through the regional resistance in Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen can affect positively the Palestine question, and hence does not result in total collapse of resistance or total ethnic cleansing? I think that we have to see this angle too. So the role of regional resistance. I'll couple this question with another question from an anonymous attendee who's thanking you for very illuminating talks, and is wondering, in the view of the urgency to stop the genocide, what is the best position to adopt in public with colleagues and students, etc.? Is it a better strategy to set aside the question of resistance, freedom fighters, settler colonialism, and focus on empathy and the loss of innocent lives? Would the immediate gains be large enough to justify tabling the political discussion? I'm assuming this is a question that is specifically relevant to campuses in Europe and the US. So one part of this is about regional resistance movements, or what is called the axis of resistance in the region. And the other one is about what best strategies to use in the US to shift this discussion. Whoever wants to start. Zahi?
I can start with the second question maybe, and Nadia can deal with the first question if you want. I mean, it's very tough. We have a chapter at Whitman, the SGP chapter, Citizens for Justice in Palestine, and they crafted a demand for our trustees to issue a statement saying, calling for a ceasefire, immediate ceasefire. And we still haven't heard from the trustees about it. And there's a great movement from students who really are moved by children dying, women dying. So there's a lot of empathy that tries to humanize the Palestinians. Like they want to repeat their stories, they want to repeat their name, right? And it says this is a Black Lives Matter generation, right? They've been, they went through high school with Black Lives Matter, now are in college. They're looking at other sites of injustice, and Palestine is at the top of their list. The question is, how do you use the currency of empathy? Empathy has currency. I think people can be moved to protest, to sign petitions demanding an end to this. If this becomes exhaustive, then this just follows the path of humanitarian reason. And I think humanitarian reason will never solve the Palestinian question. Only, in my eyes, an anti-colonial reason will open up possibilities that could open to kind of political justice. And I think students are also open to the anti-colonial reason model if they're exposed to it. If then, they understand their state as settlers, they have settler anxiety as well. So when they see what's happening in Israel, it's one way for them to deal with settler colonialism over there and not at home. Although they're also starting to go back and look at their own condition in settler states, which is why I think Western nations like Canada, France, are worried that there's going to be a reckoning with their own past that Palestine provokes. So they fear that. I don't think you can table the political. I think that comes with a great risk, because people will forget about the Palestinians once they get tired of seeing suffering on TV. They have to be motivated to support the Palestinian cause, not as a reduction of suffering.
Yeah, so I would just add to that, and I'll try to go to the first question. I think the problem, look, I mean, I'm all for not having to adjudicate the entire history of the conflict to try to get this slaughter stopped. I think the problem is you can have empathy, but then say, oh, but there's no solution. Or you can have empathy and say, but if Hamas would just agree to a ceasefire. And what it will take to stop both the slaughter and the starvation and, you know, people dying of diseases because they don't have medicine is so dramatic. In other words, the US has to cut off arms. They have to order Israel to stop. They have to bring their own ships in to deal with the problem. That if you don't have a political explanation for why it's viable to stand up to the Israeli state in that way, or to stop using them as your client state, it's hard to imagine how you get to the kinds of actions that are required. So I agree. I mean, we don't have to dispute everything from, you know, I mean, again, you know, even one person was saying, you know, I don't even really care. Call it a slaughter, call it mass murder, call it genocide. Just recognize what it is. And I mean, I think that, you know, at that level, you can say that, but it's hard to take the whole political question out and get to a solution. On the regional question, I mean, ideally, I completely agree. But the issue similarly around the region is how do those movements, I mean, those movements themselves have been paralyzed. You have Sisi, you have Assad almost having won this horrific war, you have, right? So I think that the hope, of course, is that there are, you know, sort of popular movements that even though they have not, quote unquote, won, certainly aren't, you know, that genie isn't going back into the bottle, right? It's, you know, that kind of political vision and commitments are going to be there, but realizing them in such a way that they can not only realize it within their own states, but, you know, help the question of Palestine, I think is very complicated. But I agree. I, you know, saying all this thing about the US and Europe, I don't think the only players on the table is the US and Europe. I mean, obviously, the Arab states could stop this if they wanted to. They're not going to. And now that could change if things change on the ground. But there's also the flip side. You know, I guess the reason at the moment I'm putting so much emphasis on the US is to stop this war immediately. It would take pressure from Israel's closest allies. But I also think not just, you know, Arab and Palestinian politics matter, but Israeli politics. Israel is also not what it was in the 60s and 70s. It's one of the largest economies in the world. Unlike the US and Europe, when you do popular opinion polls, and this is long before October 7th, throughout the US and Europe, the younger generation is much more liberal. Throughout Israel, and I'm talking about obviously Jewish Israelis, the population under 40 is far more right-wing and far more religious, and that has been the case for over a decade. And it's not, you know, it's not simply a client state. It's a state with an extraordinarily powerful military. It's a state with a rather robust economy. It's not going to fold the way it might have had to fold in the 50s or 60s without European support. You know, there's an internal dynamic there that is not going to be easy to overcome either. But there's just no chance of shifting that polity internally, even with the kind of support that they get from the US and Europe that is unequivocal, but they're not rolling over. So I know it can sound from this discussion that one thinks the only actors that matter are the US and Europe, but of course not. It's just in terms of what it would mean to stop the Israeli military now, I think they do matter. Mm-hmm.
I'll ask one last question before wrapping up. So there's a question from Leia Al-Ftouni, and she says, I'm interested in what you said about El-Haj's position as enacting a fetishistic disavowal, especially her critique of the global left's affinity with Hamas as being driven by a hatred of the Jews, and that displays a certain moral and political bankruptcy, rather than a humane Enlightenment left politics, so to speak. I'm interested to hear how this fetishistic disavowal is at play in Salah bin Habib's response letter to Philosophy for Palestine, but also Habermas and his assertion that never again today should be an expression of full commitment to protect Jewish life and support Israel's right to exist, an assertion that exposes a certain indifference to the genocide if not outright complicity, with the genocide in Gaza. So I guess, Zahi, this is a question for you.
Yeah, but I think Nadia will.
I'm sure Nadia, but
say about it as well. I mean, so Eva Illouz makes all the kind of moves, linking the kind of paradigm of slave revolt and Palestinian revolt could have a nice affinity, since she has made already the kind of how Israelis treat Palestinians is like how America's history in treating slaves. So it was a kind of promise there. But when, in a sense, she's still aware Palestinians are suffering, but the second part of the fetishists, this about, I know very well Palestinians are suffering, but all the same, I don't care. In this instance, in October 7th, it's the Israelis who should matter. You should bracket any kind of theorization of the occupation. So here you have a kind of pro-simplicity, right? Palestinians massacred Israeli civilians. And, there was, in her initial kind of commentary, we had the things that were never corroborated about beheading of children, right? So all that stuff, initially she brought all this in to paint Palestinians as barbarians, and now, how dare you try to justify their action, right? Which is a kind of dubious gesture between understanding and justifying. Just the way, when Derrida was reflecting on 9/11, how do we understand it? He wasn't justifying it by understanding it, but now any desire to contextualize becomes seen as an anti-Semitic gesture. And then she brings up, so shouldn't we contextualize, how Jews were escaping anti-Semitism in Europe? So it distorts the settler colonial narrative. And where can't we go back to, some Palestinian support for Hitler? Isn't that justification for the spoils of war? When the examples she gives about contextualizing, where do we go if we start contextualizing everything, is a bit ridiculous. Most critics of Zionism always acknowledge that Zionism did offer itself as a liberation movement, liberating Jews from European anti-Semitism. So that's acknowledged. I mean, Said acknowledged it, Badiou acknowledged it, Zizek acknowledges it as they're criticizing Zionism. And most settlers are fleeing something from their home nation. So it's not like, they're just going on vacation and seeking to resettle. But when you have the existence of a Palestinian people for generations living on this land, and you don't see them as actual human beings, you still have this kind of terra nullius, empty lands, the settler dream. And so the settler colonial narrative is precisely what she rejects in her fetishistic vision of still a unique Israel that can be democratic and Jewish. That's the fetish that still is operational, but it's no longer really, it's not really furthering a liberal vision. It's fueling and endorsing a right-wing vision, an ultra-nationalist vision. So this is where her fetishist disavowal is faltering. It's no longer doing the work of containing knowledge and then still have a noble idea of coexistence. No, she knows about the suffering of Palestinians, but it doesn't matter because her support is with Israel and its uniqueness. And this, for me, then there's no really a liberal position that can combat the right. So the peace camp in Israel is non-existent. I think we should reject the peace camp. And I mean, and Ben Habib studied also with Habermas, so I think they share a lot of interests. And I remember Ben Habib's review of Parting Ways, Judith Butler's Parting Ways, the critique of Zionism. Her comment to Butler is basically, you won't get too far by saying Israel is a settler state under settler colonialism. It's basically nobody is going to be happy if they're called a racist. So we should change the language. And for me, it's precisely that we should stress that Israel is a racist state, a racist project. Only then can we come up with actual solutions. If we say, well, we have to be nice, we don't want to offend people, we don't want to make them feel uncomfortable. No, I mean, you have to call it as it is.
Nadia, do you want to add anything?
I'm going to add something far more mundane. I mean, I haven't read the Selah ben Habib, and I gave up on Habermas over decades ago. But, you know, I also think we can, I think that first of all, Israel's so-called liberal left has and Zahi, you mentioned this. I mean, the whole pro-democracy stuff, it wasn't just that they weren't interested in the occupation, they blocked what was called the occupation bloc from participating. Their solution, their liberalism was actually, there's a certain level of violence, it's over there, we don't have to deal with it, whatever. They weren't going to engage it, it's just that their lives could go on. And the state made a decision that there's a certain amount of violence that they will tolerate because it's not very much. And the vast majority of the violence will be on the other side. And honestly, I just think, you know, again, here I'm just going to be whatever. What happened on October 7th is people were, were shocked out of their complacency. The idea that they might pay a price, that people they know might die or have died or be kidnapped was more than they could bear. And I just think at a much more mundane level, it's a sign. I mean, I had colleagues who, you know, I think they just fell apart for a little bit. And I'm like, if you don't understand that this is a sign of your privilege and not your vulnerability, there's a real problem here. You know, the idea that, you know, people you know were at risk or died was so devastating to you says exactly why Israelis are privileged, because that's people's everyday lives. I mean, in Palestine, but also in much of the, so anyway, I mean, I actually, there's some level which I'm not even willing to theorize it. I think it's arrogance, it's hubris, and it's privilege. And it's like, yep, well, deal with it. And people can't deal with it. Right? That's not supposed to happen to them. It's supposed to happen to other people. And then all critical faculties go out the window. And then she can rationalize it. And I mean, this, whatever this person is, can rationalize it in any way she wants, but it's really her own affect that she won't analyze. Anyway, sorry, but
yeah. No, thank you so much, Nadia. This is very, very relevant. I mean, to end on this note of, I mean, the whole discourse in the US and in Europe about Jewish students feeling unsafe versus Palestinians actually dying, and what is actually, more important or more relevant at this historical conjuncture is really beyond what I can grapple with. But thank you so much for this really very stimulating session. I think there are many, we're left with more questions than answers, which is always a great thing. Really, I mean, between from our position being based here in Beirut and, in conversation with people who are based in the US and Europe, I think it's really important to think about who are the anti-colonial and critical theorists on Palestine today. What kind of critical theory are we talking about? Critical of what, for whom, and from where? But I also, I mean, with all the criticisms of critical theory that we've highlighted today, I would like us to still believe that there is a bigger promise for critical thinking. I hope that despite the really very horrible times we're living, this has opened something in our intellectual words, in our academic words, but more importantly in our intellectual words, to think, to create a paradigm shift and to rethink. I feel many of us have had this moment of feeling that we suddenly woke up and realized what this word has become. And this is, and as much as it's a horrible recognition, but it's also probably a useful one. So I'll end here. I want to thank everyone for participating, for the great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't read all the questions, but we managed to go through 85% of them. I'll turn now to Rola, who will announce the next panels, I think.
Thank you, Rima. Thank you so much, everyone. To our speakers, to our wonderful moderator, to our great translators. Thank you for everyone who joined us. Like Rima said, we try to get to as many questions as possible, but we're always short on time, so we're sorry if we weren't able to get to your question. This webinar will be uploaded to our YouTube channel in the next few days. We would love to see everyone again next month on April 5th for our 4th webinar in this series. More information will be posted on our social media platforms closer to the date. So hopefully we'll see everyone again. Thank you so much and have a great night and great day, depending where you're from. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.